So today we're going to move a little bit away from some of this stuff we've typically done more biologically based and move to a totally different area in terms of disability studies and our understanding of disabilities and how they're defined and how we view them as a society. And so our guest is Dr. Madeline Burghardt. She has her Ph.D. in critical disability studies from York University. How many Ph.D. programs are there in Ontario?
In disability studies, one, but at OISE they have a social justice and equity in education, which also has a disability studies component.
So York is the only PhD program?
In critical disability.
So you guys don't have a PhD program here?
No.
Oh, right. No. I thought
There's no graduate program in disability studies.
So currently Dr. Burghardt is an instructor in the School of Health Policy and Management at York and is also an associate professor?
I'm an instructor here at King's. Yeah.
At Disability Studies program. Her research interests have been the governance of geopolitical arrangements of disability, historical injustice, and narrative research in people labeled with an intellectual disability, and which obviously is why we asked Dr. Burghardt to come. She recently published a book within the last year.
Yes.
Called Institutions, Families, and the Construction of Intellectual Disability. I guess it's broken. Institutions, Families, and Construction of Intellectual Disability, which I think is a history of institutions in Ontario.
I'm going to talk about it a lot today to give you a good sense of what's in the book. And
But anyway, so thank you for coming and welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you. Is it okay if I sit or, because it's just easier to face you and then whatever, turn the slide. Okay, thank you for having me. It's really great to see so many people here so late in the afternoon. Do you need me to speak into the mic?
No, we'll pull it off.
It's okay? So there's really three things I want to do today in my talk with you. So I'm going to be moving really quickly because I'm supposed to try and leave some time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So forgive me for that. And I just want to say, because it has been published as a book, the book obviously goes into a lot more detail of the history and the stories that I'm going to share with you. So just that's a backup. So there's really three things I want to do today. Does this work? Doesn't seem to be. We did check. We did check. So you're gonna go now? There we go. Okay. So basically, the three sections is the first thing I want to talk about is my research that I did for my PhD, which informs the book. The second part will be taking a step back then and looking at the historical conditions that contributed to the development of institutions for people with intellectual disabilities in Ontario. And I'm going to qualify that in just a moment for you. And then the last part is just kind of then trying to draw from the stories that I've shared with you, as well as the history and the conditions that contributed to institutionalization in Ontario, and think about how can we draw from those conditions to think about how we practice now, how we interact with people who have an intellectual disability or are labeled as such. So that's kind of the three parts that I'm going to be covering. So I just want to sort of do a little bit of housekeeping first. The first thing is that I have a PhD in critical disability studies from York. My undergraduate degree was in occupational therapy. So I have this interesting perspective of having been in a rehab field with a lot of on-hands work. I was a pediatric OT. I worked in Timmins for 3 years, and then I worked in Zimbabwe for 3 years, and then I came back and worked in Toronto for a year before I started doing graduate work. So I have that perspective, which makes me, I feel, both understanding of the profession and also somewhat critical of it as well, and that'll come through in the last part of the talk. The other thing is language. I was always trained to say people with intellectual disabilities or people with developmental disabilities. Within disability studies, we have started to use the term disabled people more as a reclaiming, actually, of the term disabled, but also using disabled to mean from the social model of disability, where society is seen as disabling people through the obstacles and barriers that exist in society. So when we say disabled people, that means people who are disabled by society. So the term disabled people has kind of been flipped again, and it's now seen more as a, not exactly a pride term, but a re-owning of identity. And the word survivor, I do use the word institutional survivor in this talk and in the book and in my research. And the reason for that, I know we hear the word survivor a lot these days, you know, survivors of Indian residential schools, survivors of trauma, etc. And my very first interview with someone who lived in a long-term stay institution, I asked him, one of my first questions was, how long did you live in the institution? And he just said, stop right there. I didn't live in the institution, I survived there. And he told me the survivor community wants to be named as such. And so that was why I adopted that terminology when I refer to that community. And when I talk about institutions, I'm really referring to the long-term government-run, government-supported institutions for people labeled with an intellectual disability in Ontario. Primarily the three really big ones. So there was Huronia Regional Centre near Orillia, and then and that goes way back to 1876 that I'm going to talk about at this. And then there was Rideau Regional Centre near Smiths Falls, which opened in 1951. And then there was Southwest Regional Centre, which was not far from here, near Blenheim, I think, which opened in 61. So those are the three institutions that almost all of the people I spoke with had lived. So that's really what I'm referring to. But I think when we think about the effects of institutionalization, the point of the last part of the talk today is to think about how do institutional practices kind of pervade all kinds of institutional environments, not just those really, really big places. But that's really my reference point of those three big government-run institutions, which closed in 2009. So just 10 years ago. Okay, so what I want to talk about is how I got onto this topic in the first place. So I have a long history with L'Arche as well. I lived in 2 different L'Arche communities in Toronto and Richmond Hill. And I have a long working and sort of life relationship with many people who have intellectual disabilities. And a few years ago, when I was in the midst of trying to figure out exactly what my research question should be for my doctorate, and any of you who've done graduate work know how hard that process can be, trying to figure out your precise research question. I was at a funeral for a man who had lived most of his life, like over 40 years of his life, at the Huronia Regional Centre. This was a man who had Down syndrome. And he passed away, and he had lived the last 7 years of his life in the community, in a large home. And I was at his funeral, and I was actually in the group that was doing music at his funeral, so I could see the gathering of people. I could see the congregation. And in the front row were seated all his siblings. And he had come from a really big family. He had several brothers and sisters. And I felt, and I have to just say this is my presumption, because I didn't speak to them at the funeral or afterwards, but I felt they looked kind of overwhelmed. Because I don't know if any of you have ever been to a large funeral, but it was this really huge celebratory event, and that's what the images on the slide are about. Like, there was a lot of music, there was a lot of story sharing, pointing to this man's contribution to the community and what a great, how much he contributed to his home and to his workplace outside of the home in those last 7 years of his life that this crowd knew him from. And I just became curious then, like, what was it like for his family sitting there with this celebration going on around them, celebrating this man's contribution, when I thought to myself, probably as young children themselves, they had been told something probably quite different about their brother who had Down syndrome and had to be sent away to live somewhere else, away from the family home because he was different, because he should be with people of his own kind, perhaps that he would bog down the family in some way, whatever message they had received. So I became really curious about what was it like for the family also in terms of their understanding of disability and in their understandings of each other. And so eventually that led to the research question, which was really to try and understand the effect that institutionalization had on families' understandings of disability and on their understandings of each other. And so what I did was I interviewed people who had lived in institutions, as well as siblings and parents. And the idea was obviously to capture people who were still alive. And these were people who had generally been institutionalized after the Second World War, like starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So that's kind of the time period that I was basing the research on. So I spoke with 9 survivors. I mean, it's a relatively small study because it was qualitative in nature, very in-depth. And of course, I had a bit of a time limit. But I spoke with 9 survivors, 11 siblings, 8 parents, 2 of whom had not institutionalized. And at first I wasn't going to include them because the idea was I was speaking only with people who had chosen to institutionalize. And in the end, I'm really glad I kept them in the study because they really helped me to understand a lot about what parents had been going through during the decision-making process, etc. And I spoke with 4 former staff of one of the really large institutions and 4 people who I call key informants. These were people who knew a lot about institutionalization and had worked with people who had been deinstitutionalized, but they themselves were not directly connected, right? And they were really helpful as well. So it was kind of classic qualitative interviews. I used a tape recorder in all except I think one of the interviews with people's consent, and I transcribed them and then did my analysis from there, really sort of trying to find out themes from each of the groups and then themes across the groups as well. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to go through each of those groups and just quickly go through some of the main things that emerged in the findings, what people told me about their experiences. So I put this slide in, and I always show this to my students and other people when I talk about the effects of institutionalization. And so, because this is the image that came to my mind when I was trying to figure out what this had meant for many people. And so the drop of water hitting the surface of the pond, if you will, was the survivor, was the person who'd been institutionalized. And then out from there are all these effects, these rings that keep extending outwards, because what I kept hearing was how broad these effects were, how many people were affected. When you think about the thousands who were institutionalized in these big institutions, and then if they have 3 or 4 siblings, how many people are affected, and then their children and cousins, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and you realize how many people in Ontario, just Ontario, have been affected by this phenomenon. So that was the image that came to my mind. So to just speak first about the survivors, and so the part of the title of this talk is "It Wrecked Me Sadly," and that was something that one of the survivors said to me. He had lived at Rideau Regional Center near Smiths Falls, and for him that was the overall. I asked him at the end, you know, what would you say was your overall experience of living in an institution? And he said, "It wrecked me sadly." And I thought that really summarized what so many of the survivors said. They all said it was the worst period of their lives. They did not like it there. I can think of 2 survivors who said one very slightly positive thing. Like I remember one woman, she really hated it. And then at one point she just said, well, the Swiss steak wasn't too bad. And that was the best she could say about it. And I mean, so just to say, you know, we can understand institutions as offering different things to people, but not one survivor spoke about it in a positive way. It was a negative experience. It was the worst time of their lives. They all said that. And just to explain the image there, I don't know if any of you have been to Huronia. This is in the cemetery at the Huronia Regional Center. So there is a pretty large cemetery there for people who died while they were institutionalized. And in the earliest years, probably the first 70 years or so of its existence, there were no names on people's graves, just numbers. So this is a collection of some of those gravestones with just the numbers on them, no names, which in itself is extremely dehumanizing. The people, when they died, there was no name on the tombstones, just numbers. And they are collected like this in this patio formation, because at one point in its history, a bunch of gravestones were dug up and used to build a pathway. Finally, a couple decades later, a pastor said, this is wrong. We need to commemorate these in some way. And they took the stones and brought them back and put them in the cemetery. But by then they'd lost where they were supposed to be. So they were just put together in this, it's kind of like a square, maybe the size of this section of the room with all these tombstones on. And I just thought for me that symbolized a lot of the dehumanization that happened in the institutions, and just that people weren't even buried, not the dehumanization not only in life but also in death, right? That their names were not even there.
Was there any way to check who the number is related to, or is that lost?
There's a group of people called Remember Every Name, who are working really, really hard to try and connect these numbers with names, and it's really difficult because they have to go to the archives and dig through just wads and wads of records, etc. So it's a really good question. So I want to just talk about some of these features that survivors explained to me. So and that image is from the archives of Ontario. It's also a picture of the Huronia Regional Center, a young boy sitting on a bed, and you can just see how the beds are lined up. Looks very institutional. So exclusion, by that I mean exclusion from society. They were segregated from society and more or less were invisible to everybody else, to the rest of the community. But by exclusion, I also mean that people were excluded from decision-making in their daily lives, and they were excluded from decisions about their own future. Like, all of the people who lived there said they had no idea that they were going to live in the institution. They were told they were going to live there, and it was the same when they left for a lot of them. They weren't part of that decision-making process. So there's those kinds of exclusions as well. The regimentation was about the running of the institution took precedence over people's desires for how they wanted to live their days and live their lives. So it was like a schedule imposed, superimposed from above, you know, when you eat, when you go to bed, when you bathe, all those things extremely regimented. There was no freedom in there. The dehumanization, I've already spoken about that a little bit, but survivors told me some really, really horrible stories about, you know, the washrooms didn't have any cubicles. The showers didn't have cubicles when they first went there. It was all just out in the open. People had to get dressed and undressed in front of each other. And there were also dehumanizing punishments, like side rooms where they would be placed if they did something that was seemingly out of line. You know, it could be as simple as talking back or stepping out of line when you're waiting for your food in the cafeteria, etc. So there were a lot of punishments that survivors had a hard time explaining to me why they thought they had been punished, right? And then, you know, some pretty hard stories of abuse as well. And we know that because in 2010, two women who had lived at Huronia launched a class action lawsuit against the Ontario government for abuse and harms that they had suffered while living at Huronia. And since then, there have been many stories that have emerged from survivors from the other two institutions as well about sexual and physical abuse and harassment, etc. So there's evidence that these things happened. And if any of you did hear the White Coat Black Art episode that was on a few weeks ago, Christopher was a man on, and I bring it up at the end of the talk. He spoke about his time at Huronia, and he was abused, and that's in the clip on the radio show. And the last thing I have on the slide here is abandonment. And for me, what became clear to me was that with all these horrible things that happened to survivors, the thing that hurt them the most was that their families had abandoned them to that. So overriding all of these other difficult experiences was this sense of being abandoned to that, left to that by their families. And that's a quote from one of the survivors as well. They left me, they abandoned me. And she was speaking about her family. So that sense of profound loss, that not only were they suffering these things, but they had more or less that their family had chosen to take them in there. I think some of the survivors realize now that many of their families did not know the extent to which they were going to suffer while they were living there. Otherwise, their parents might not have taken them there, right? So there's some of that understanding. And some of the survivors have also, who are more astute, were able to identify that they were also felt abandoned by the state, that the government had promised their family that they would take care of them. So they felt a sense of abandonment from the government as well. And so that was very hard for some of the survivors when they learned that the government knew things were not good in the institutions, but didn't address the issues and didn't close them down. So those were the survivors. And then I'm sorry that picture's too dark for the room. It's just an image of a young girl with her mom and baby sister. This is part of a book that's recently been published by Victoria Freeman. She's the little girl on the right, about her own experience of losing her sister to the Rideau Regional Center when her sister was 2 years old. So that's from her book. But the thing about the siblings, which was really interesting, was a lot of them were quite angry about their parents' decision to institutionalize. I wouldn't say that all of the siblings were angry, and all of them spoke about how as they get older, they understand better what their parents were going through and feeling a little more sympathetic towards their parents' situation. But there was still quite a bit of anger about the parents' decision to institutionalize, because parents often took their first playmate away from them. And that was often very confusing. Most siblings talked about it not being discussed with them. This was just a decision that was made. Some of them didn't even know, came home from school one day and their brother or sister was gone. So huge senses of loss and confusion around that. Another thing that was really interesting from the siblings was this experience of having to navigate family secrets or stories that were not shared outside of the family home. So I had a couple of sisters say to me that outside the family, outside of the home, we were a family of 4. And inside the home, we were a family of 5. And so as young children, they were trying to navigate these different stories. And they weren't always certain who they could share this with. Who is it safe to tell? Who is it not safe to tell? And that was also difficult when they were teenagers, not knowing who knew that they had a brother who didn't live with the family, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of them spoke about that difficulty navigating those different narratives. And a lot of them felt a lot of burdens. This felt responsibility to succeed. It was like they sensed from their parents the need to demonstrate that this disability was indeed an anomaly in their family. It was a fluke. Therefore, if they could achieve and be high achieving in school and outside of school, it would provide evidence that this was just a fluke. This was not a family inheritance thing. And a lot of the siblings spoke about that, felt pressure. And a lot of the women I spoke with also assumed a lot of responsibility, because many of them spoke about their moms really struggling with this decision and grieving for a long, long time, some of them, sometimes their whole lives, about the decision to institutionalize a child, and that often the daughters picked up a lot of that responsibility of keeping the family going and felt that from a very young age, like 8, 9 years old, feeling that they had to be the ones to kind of energize the family, which was really stressful as well. Some of them felt a great deal of guilt about that a sibling was taken away and that they weren't. Why did he have to suffer and I got to stay home? There was also, some of them did express relief that the family had been somewhat dysfunctional, and that removing the child with the disability did create a sense of relief in the family home that they picked up on. So there was also that experience as well. And siblings spoke about long processes of reconciliation that they're still going through with their parents and with their siblings as well. One woman spoke to me about her brother who didn't know he had a brother who had been institutionalized. Never knew until he was himself an adult. And she says, still now, I don't. We have this process that we're trying to go through to sort through why I knew and why he didn't. So some really painful stuff there.
Did that person's parents ever explain to him why they hadn't told him?
No. And so it's been really painful in that family. The mom has since passed away, and she just says, my dad will never talk to him about it. So, yeah. So to move to the parents, and they're also different. It's just really interesting. But the first thing I need to say is that the context about which we're speaking here, after the war, 50s and 60s, there were very few resources for families and very little support if you had a child with an intellectual disability or some kind of extra needs, right? And so parents were working in a vacuum. And as the quote, I don't think I have it here, maybe on the next slide, that if the choice was institutionalization or nothing, some parents, it's not really a choice, and that some parents, for realistic and understandable reasons, chose the institution. Because the government said, we'll take care of your child for the rest of their lives. We will pay for it, we will take care of your child. Yet if you kept your child at home, you got nothing. So the 2 parents that I spoke with who did not institutionalize, they were groundbreakers. They were women who started nursery schools for their children, tried to get groups going for parents of children with disabilities, etc. So if you weren't willing to give your child up, then you had to assume that you were going to work really hard to create those resources. And I emphasize that with my students. I think it's hard for students sometimes to understand that these were not bad parents. There was nothing there for them, right? And so it made their decisions so much more difficult. What was interesting with the parents was that they were really divergent opinions. Some really regretted the decision that they had institutionalized and were very sad about that and carried that for the rest of their lives. Some remained confident, even when I spoke to them in their 80s and in their 90s, remained confident in that decision and felt that that had been the best decision they've made for their child and for their family. And that I found very interesting. This was after the class action had started and all these stories were coming out about abuse and mistreatment, that parents still remained adamant that this was the right decision that they had made. And I understand that. I think it's hard for all of us humans to go back to decisions we've made in an earlier time of our life and revisit them when there might be some regret there or some, you know, a difficult decision that we've made. It's not easy for any of us to go back into those decisions and try and reevaluate what we did, right? It's quite understandable. There's also this really gendered nature to the decision making, is that moms were really carrying the bulk of the caregiving in the home alone without the dads being very present for the most part. And a lot of the moms spoke to me about being told by their doctor, you're not capable of raising this child on your own. And so there was a lot of gendered stuff going on there as well, which I'll talk about again a bit more in a few minutes. So
from what you saw, was it more the fathers who were in favor of institutionalization?
I don't know if I'd say in favor, but certainly the fathers were, if the woman wanted to institutionalize, they certainly didn't question it. They didn't challenge it. I mean, I had one dad say to me, he was giving her so much trouble and she couldn't do it all on her own. What were we supposed to do? Like, it was interesting that he didn't think of it as, I wish I'd been more present. It was more like she couldn't handle it, so we had no other choice. We had to institutionalize. And I would say that what the children told me was that the dads were mostly influencing the decisions. So it's kind of interesting. The women were doing the caregiving, but the men still carried a lot more influence in the home, right? And that was typical of the period. So the last point on that slide I found really key to my research, because it really demonstrated that the way that the parents interpreted disability had a great deal to do with how they interpreted institutions. So if the parents saw the disability as, they saw the child as the problem, that the child and the child's disability was the problem, then institutions was a much more reasonable response, right? It was something that could answer to that problem. But if the parents had a more nuanced or complex assessment of disability, you know, that it's not just my son's Down syndrome, but the fact that there are no resources, the fact that people don't understand it, the fact that there's stigma and shame attached to that. Parents who had more complicated understandings of disability were much more likely to question the value of institutions like this, and were much more likely to hesitate and to regret their decision after. So I found that very interesting, that parents who, and it was the parents who had not changed their decision who were more likely to really say that disability was still the problem, right? So I found that a very interesting finding.
Were the kids more disabled with those parents who saw that?
No, not necessarily. No, they were people who had Down syndrome who ended up living almost independently in the community and functioning well. And yeah, so no, not necessarily. That's an interesting question, though.
Was most of your sample then people with Down syndrome?
I'd have to go back and check. I would say probably. Well, see, I'd have to look at all of them. So the survivors I spoke with, no. The siblings, probably there were at least half who had Down syndrome. Yeah, and probably same with the parents. So that's a good question as well. But the actual survivors I spoke with, no, the majority did not have Down syndrome. Yeah.
Were the siblings and the parents related to the survivors, or were they?
Some of them were. So I couldn't get a totally fantastic sample, right? So some of them were. So Christopher, who you heard on the radio, I also spoke with his, he was part of my project, and so were his two siblings. So that worked out really well, but both his parents had died. So, you know, it's really hard to get whole families together, but would have been ideal.
You wonder if people might have been less willing to speak out
Yes.
if their parents were still alive.
That's right. Well, then, and I did get some parents whose children had died. So it was kind of a very interesting, that's an interesting observation. Thank you. Yeah. So the former staff was also a really key learning for me when I spoke to them. I only spoke with 4, and they had all worked at one of the really big institutions, but they all said it was the best job I ever had. So as a researcher, you know, I'm listening to this, and I'd already spoken with almost all my survivors, and they had all told me it was the worst place I ever lived. So I'm sort of juxtaposing these two truths in my mind, and I did believe all of them, right? They're both speaking their own truth. For the former staff, that was the best job they ever had. And so what that illustrates to me is not that someone isn't speaking the truth or whatever. It's not that. It's that if the best job you ever had is at the expense of someone else's life, like that's the worst place they've ever lived, then there's something wrong with the system, right? There's something wrong with that model if your best job means someone else is suffering in that way.
But can it be a direct correlation? Because I worked in one of these institutions, and I worked in another one, and a lot of staff and clients really enjoyed themselves together. So.
Sure. And I don't disagree with that, but I also feel that what was really clear to me was that all the survivors said it was the worst place I ever lived, and they didn't overall like it. It doesn't mean they didn't like some of the staff, for sure. And you're right, it's more subtle than that. But what I think, what it shows to me is that if for staff it's the best place they've ever worked, and yet survivors are telling me it was not a good place for me to live, that I just think that means that shows us there's some injustice in the system, in the model, right? It doesn't mean that the staff are bad people. It doesn't mean that some of the survivors didn't have good experiences while living there. Absolutely, you're right, it's more
But I think
complicated
some
than that.
survivors may have good memories as well.
They may have good
Some of-
memories as well. All the ones I spoke to, overriding their experience, it was negative. So that's what I had to convey, right? And you're right. Some of them, one of them said he enjoyed singing in the choir. One of them, you know, it's really quite hard for me to recall positive things they said about it. And that's just what I heard as someone who was interviewing them. So you're right. It wasn't all every day, everything was terrible, but overall their experience was negative, is what they shared with me. Right?
Yes, the problem,
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of ward or unit you work on, but
Yeah.
but really by definition, the people you spoke with were able to describe their experiences. And so people who may
Yeah.
have had significantly lower cognitive experience or abilities may not have experienced things differently for whatever reason.
Mhm.
And so it's, in that sense, a skewed sample, but because you can't interview
course.
people who can't communicate with you.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point, because that had been my original wish. I had wanted to speak to people. I wanted to work with people who are nonverbal about their experiences of vulnerability. And I just realized that as a student, that I had significant limitations, and it would take years to really spend a lot of time with people who are nonverbal to start to understand experiences and try and make sense of that. And I didn't have the capability or the time. Like, it would have taken me years to try and discern people's experiences in a nonverbal way, like, because I didn't have the capability, sort of, you know,
I don't think anybody has
significant.
that capability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it takes years of knowing someone to sort of understand what different gestures and behaviors and whatever mean, right? And I just didn't have the
I
time
think
for that.
it is hard to put some of these things side by side. So, you know, I think if all of us think back on our school career,
Mhm.
I think, you know, grade 3 was like the worst year of my school year of my life.
Yes.
It doesn't mean the teacher or the program was so terrible. It may have just had been a bad fit at that
Yes.
time. And then, you know, I think, would you choose to live in a ward, you know, and have to shower with a bunch of people? Or do you like the place you have now with your own bedroom and a nice
Mhm.
glassed-in shower? Well, probably you like the one with the glassed-in shower, but that wasn't an option when these folks were.
But how about the client who's, you know, every night she just strips in front of everybody and laughs and sits there and seems to be what.
Right,
she
but I'm
wants
just
to
saying,
do.
there could
No,
have
I
been,
get it.
for everybody living in that situation, there could have been a better place.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it wasn't like,
But
it's hard when there isn't another option,
But I
right?
guess
Because
I-
they're not comparing that to living at home, you know, locked in their room with the parent holding the door closed because they're so aggressive and they're
Right.
scared to let it.
But I
don't
guess-
have that option to look at. So I think you're right, that the system is clearly not the best one, and we've
Yeah.
moved on, but I guess it's just hard to compare it to a sort of theoretical something else that just wasn't available.
Right. And I guess, so the point is, like, there was no other option, but that's part of the question, is why was there no other option, right? And so, like, and that we need to be taking those questions and making sure it doesn't happen again, right? And so, but what I mean by this is, when you place those two things side by side, to me, it indicates there is room there to question the system, and that for me there's some injustice embedded in it if you can have such divergent opinions about basically the same phenomenon. So that's really what the point of that is for me to just sort of put that out there as a question, right? Like, how.
So as you're talking, it's kind of reminding me, because we don't have these facilities for children anymore, but with the geriatric group, for which we do have government-run facilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where people
Yeah.
are told, you know, we can support your
Yeah,
aging parents and put them
Absolutely.
in here, and it's government funded and so on and
Yeah.
so forth. And are we going to be in 50
Exactly.
years looking back at all the abuse and this and that and
Yes.
interviewing? I guess the thing is, they all are going to die fairly quickly, so we won't have so many people to interview down the road.
yeah,
But if we did, you know,
absolutely. I think that,
you know, nobody
yeah.
is putting their adult parent into a government-run home with the knowledge that they could be being abused, but maybe they are.
Well, I think we know for sure they have been in places.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
But I think that
I didn't want to jump to conclusions without doing the research, but
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm really uncomfortable with what's happening right now with seniors in our culture, in our society. Absolutely. And not comfortable with it at all. In fact, it's so interesting because that's a conversation I have with my kids all the time. What in 50 years are you going to be looking back and saying, oh my God, I can't believe you guys did that. That was so horrible. And I say, I think it's seniors' homes. Like they're going to say, I can't believe, so I just think that time may indicate, again, this is a practice that right now we're not doing it differently. Maybe we can say we don't have other choices. I mean, I think we can. There are other ways we can be looking at this, but we're in a bit of a hole right now in terms of the government and policy and funding, right?
Well,
So-
I'm not supportive of institutions and, they're not great places. I think that's, we can all agree on that. But I think for me, what I struggle with looking at it in the present day, when the mindset was just so different.
Absolutely.
When,
Yeah.
and like it really shows the evolution of how we approach life. Like disability was looked at so differently.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
everything. So it's really kind of.
Well, but
Yeah, so-
even if you go back a few hundred years, not just 100, I mean, I think most people with Down syndrome, I assume, wouldn't have lived
That's right. They
for
wouldn't have
very
lived
long
into
at all,
adulthood
in a
anyway.
fairly short period of time. But it's unfortunate that you weren't able to interview, because in hindsight, you can say, boy, I wish we could have done that. If you could have interviewed people before and after leaving the institution. Because I wonder, once you've moved out and you've seen there are different options, then
Yes.
things may look much worse with hindsight. But at the time,
Mhm.
would they have thought it was so terrible? If that's all somebody knew, would they have thought it was
Right.
terrible? And there's no way to answer that question.
There's
which is
no
a shame.
way, but
Yeah.
I mean, so I guess my point with this is, I absolutely the context, I totally take that into consideration. But I just think when, in any situation, not only this one, but when you get such divergent expressions about an identical phenomenon, to me, that's just a flag. We should be paying attention to that because that could be evidence of just something unjust embedded in that system. If you have some people saying it was a great job and others saying I really hated living there, so that's really worth looking at, right? So that's really what I'm saying here.
Well, and some
Yeah.
of the people that you've interviewed seem to me to be capable people.
Mhm.
Like I know one that was at Southwestern,
Mhm.
now lives in London, and she's living on her own independently. So
Mhm.
yeah, it doesn't fit that she was living in an institution because she's capable. But that's a small percentage of the individuals who are actually in the
That's right.
institution.
And that is a limitation of the study because I could only speak with people who
Yeah,
were
yeah.
able to speak with me. And so, and like I said, I would have really been happy to speak with people who are more vulnerable and are nonverbal and perhaps less capable of others. Yeah, these were definitely a group that could speak with me about their experiences. Although a few of them were fairly limited in they had someone with them who would assist at different points to speak to me. But that's great. I mean, I'm grateful for all the input. I'm just wondering if I can keep going. So the key informants were helpful in terms of giving me a bit of a broader perspective, like a long-term perspective on what had happened and the whole system and how deinstitutionalization happened. And they also, it was really interesting. So one of the key informants who spoke with me, who's the former lawyer for community living, pointed out to me how he helped me to sort of flip our understanding of amenities that the institutions offered. So his point was that yes, institutions offered a lot to people. There were things like pools and programming and schools, etc. And his point was that was evidence of the human rights abuses, if you want, that's a pretty strong word, but the travesties that were happening because of institutions. Like, why was it that people were not able to go to school or to a pool or to the library in their own community? Like, that was his point. We need to be working to build those up in the community, as opposed to saying, well, this is where the services are, and so that's where people have to go. So he just helped me to kind of understand in that way that our energy needed to go towards building up communities so people could stay home and go to school with their brothers and sisters instead of having to go to the institution in order to access an education. So that was actually just really helpful for me to contextualize that a bit. So I want to really, I realize we don't have a ton of time, is just to run through some of the conditions for the development of institutions. And the reason is I think this can help us as we keep moving in our relationships with people who have intellectual disabilities. And I've just got 4 that I want to mention here. And the first one is the idea of charity, because most institutions started with charitable good intentions, right? That this was going to be a good thing for people who needed the services that they could provide in the institution. And the original ideas were therapeutic and rehabilitative and educative. And so it's important to recognize the charitable origins of institutions. And a lot of them had religious foundings. And, you know, we can go back a couple hundred years in this. Almshouses, shelters, and things like that are kind of is what Stiquet calls, and he's a disability studies historian. He talks about those almshouses and shelters in Europe in the 16 and 1700s as forerunners to what became in the 20th century institutions. And his words are the single formula for persons marked by difference, but he was really referring to long-term institutions. So it's just important to recognize those good intentions. That was especially true in the United States, where there was more of a therapeutic rehabilitative model. And by the time institutions began in Canada, in Ontario, Aurelia being the first one in 1876, a lot of that therapy rehabilitative approach wasn't really implemented, and it became almost custodial almost right away. You know, people were going to live there, and there was less, you know, with waxing and waning, like over the years in terms of schools going in, and then, but there was a certain amount of inconsistency. But it's just really important to remember that the origins were, for the most part, charitable. Capitalism is a really, really important feature of the rise of institutions. And this is important because we still live in a very capitalist society, and the way we organize care and the way we organize our interactions with marginalized communities are within that capitalist system. Because when capitalism, you know, if we talk about the Industrial Revolution, there was a division of people who were considered productive and people who were considered non-productive. Productive people went into workhouses, and non-productive people went into asylums. So it's that division between people who could produce for this emerging capitalist society and those who could not, that also really supported the development of segregated institutions for people considered mad or disabled, right? So that was a pretty big influence on their development. It's also just important to recognize the connections between capitalism and institutions, that people who were living there often in the earliest days were made to work to support the institution, like building the wall around CAMH in downtown Toronto. That was all unpaid patient labor. Doing laundry, taking care of other residents, gardening, etc. So there's, you know, ongoing discussions about whether that kind of work is therapeutic or exploitative, right? There's a big tension there. And many of the people I spoke with who lived in institutions spoke about that, you know, and that tension was even there for them. You know, they didn't necessarily mind taking care of some of the other residents, but this is work that they were never paid for, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very interesting feature as well. And there, in the early days, institutions were seen as self-supporting micro-communities. In fact, the 2 first superintendents at Huronia thought they could get by with very little money from the government because they had this workforce right there at their disposal. So it's important for us just to remember that history and to think about what's the role that our systems of care, how are they connected to capitalism and how we fund things, etc. Just sort of something to keep in mind. Science had a huge role in the development of institutions, including the eugenics movement at the turn of the 20th century. As Tyre and Bell say in that quote, there was science gave faith in the perfectibility of man. In other words, that we could perfect the human race, and that institutions played a role in that. So science, as we all know, has played a role in explaining different conditions such as Down syndrome, like discovering genetic causes for different kinds of disabilities or impairments. Science has also been used to identify through things like the IQ test and other forms of assessment. And science has also been used to try and solve disability. And you know, eugenics is an example of that, where if we can, you know, in the 30, 40-year period at the turn of the 20th century when eugenics was really encouraged, when women who were considered feeble-minded were discouraged from having any children, and many were sterilized, especially in Alberta. So science has been used in different ways to try and solve this problem of disability. And that's a thread I think we could all relate to a certain extent, ongoing. Like how does that still happen? In what ways is that acceptable? In what ways is that not acceptable, right? And to understand institutions as eugenic instruments, that they were really used as tools to prevent certain people from reproducing, right? Men and women were kept separate, they were taken out of society. And that was clearly stated in the intentions of those early institutions, was to take groups of people out of the population to stop the sort of pollution of the gene pool. So science is another one. And the last one I want to mention is colonization. And the reason I speak about that is because the Indian residential schools in Canada and the development of institutions for people considered feeble-minded, in the words of Chris Chapman, who's a social work instructor at York University, they map neatly one onto the other. And that's why I kind of superimpose those images there. The top one is an Indian residential school, and the bottom one is an old partial image of Huronia. And the Aurelia Asylum for Idiots, and I say that in quotation marks, which was then called Huronia, opened in 1876. And the Indian Act was signed in 1876. So there is a big part of the Indian Act was formalizing Indian residential schools and expanding them. So there is this strong overlap in sort of the whole fabric of Canadian history and the social fabric of Canada that included dealing with problematic populations, the Indian problem, which is how it was named, as well as the problem of people who were considered feeble-minded. They overlap very closely, and it's really only now are we starting to kind of figure out these connections, and important to understand them. And institutionalization is one piece of that colonial history, right? So I have that image there of Huronia, and then there's an image of an Indian residential school, and also I put there an image of the Japanese internment camps in BC after the Second World War. And when I talk to my students, we talk about this. What are other historical examples of incarceration against people's will that is part of our history? Just trying to understand that in a bit of a bigger perspective, as opposed to just this is how people with disabilities were treated. So for me, that is something really worth exploring. So I know we need to move on, and just to give you again, so the picture at the bottom, now you've seen it many times now, that was 1876, the Aurelia Asylum was opened. The picture up there on the left, that's the Rideau Regional Center, and that was a newspaper clipping, Modern Hospital School for Mentally Deficient. That was opened in 1951. And then the Southwest Regional Center, which isn't too far from here, was opened in 61. And so to me, that's just to sort of summarize the Ontario history. It's really interesting to me that 51 and 61 are the dates when those really big institutions opened. By that time, the parents' movement was already pretty active. The civil rights movement was starting in the States. The feminist movement was starting. Things were changing. There was the UN Declaration of Human Rights, etc. But still, the Ontario government chose to continue the model of large, huge institutions. And I just find that very interesting. And really, they were to absorb Huronia's overflow. And if you look on a map, they kind of cover the whole southern part of Ontario. You know, if you think of Smith Falls and near Ottawa, and then Glenheim in the southwest, and then Huronia kind of in the middle. So they were really covering the whole province. And for me, it's interesting that even though there were other movements in the community to change things, they still chose to build these really big total institutions. And there's lots of reasons for that reluctance for them to look at other models that we don't have time to get into today. It has a lot to do with the fact that they employed a lot of people in small communities, some of which were depressed, right? Smith Falls pulp and paper mill had closed. So there were reasons why they wanted to keep these places open as well.
But the people who ended up in Smiths Falls and Southwest Regional Center, it took the government 75 years to build the second institution. What happened to those extra people in that 75 years?
So Huronia was just always overcrowded, for sure. And that's what I know about it. I mean, I think obviously there are families who were keeping some of their children at home as well. And there were some smaller institutions around the province, but Huronia was always overcrowded, always. And what's interesting too is that Walt Williston was appointed by the government to do a study in 71. So in 1971, after some deaths at the Rideau Regional Center that were quite tragic, he did this report and he said it's time to start closing them and putting our resources into the community. But it took from 1971 to 2009 for them to close. So that's a long time. And so it's interesting to look at that period and understand what the recalcitrance was, or just what the hesitancy was from the government's end around why that was happening.
Is it at all possible they were waiting until they had resources?
Well, that's a good question, because they still didn't have resources when they closed them all, right? And so it's not as if they did a lot of careful planning. I mean, when they closed, they still really weren't ready, right? So, and we all know that there's, you know, hundreds of people who are still waiting for better places.
Well, I think we've seen with mental hospitals that those places, like prisons and new mental hospitals, they've closed it.
That's right.
Institutions.
And so it's a different form of, exactly. Yeah. So,
The financial component of it all, did we spend more or less money on institutions than we spend now?
well, it started to shift, right? It started to be, although it had been a more efficient way in the earlier years, institutions started to become the more expensive way to care for people, right? But it was also had to do with the conservative governments. You know, Ontario had conservative governments for most of the 20th century. Conservative governments tend not to want to support social welfare endeavors so much as more traditional medical models, and so they were a little bit more embedded in the historical models, and also they depended on the rural vote in those communities, and those communities were wanting the institutions to stay open, so there was some political connections there as well. I think that's partly what was going on. I mean, I do think it's interesting that they closed under Kathleen Wynne's watch, like she was the premier when they closed. So there is some connection there, not fully understood at this point. I think more research needs to be done there about what was going on.
But there's quite a gap between the last one closing and some of the previous ones closing.
A gap, but do you mean connecting back to 71 or?
Well, I know like Oxford Regional Center closed in the mid-90s.
Yeah, some of the smaller ones, you're right.
Wasn't that small?
Right. Yes. Okay. I hear you. You're right. There was gradual closures, but it really took to 2009 before they were really closed.
Well, it was until the.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know there that the money was supposed to follow each client into the community.
I just don't, I wonder whether, you know, do we pay more as a society, of course, prorated costs for, you know, inflation and all that stuff. Did we spend more then on institutions, or do we spend more now on?
That's a good question. I don't know I don't know the complete answer.
But you think something else, because you'd think that institutional care would be cheaper just because on staffing you'd pay
Everybody's
far
there,
less.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, so if it was more expensive to keep people in institution than a group home, sort of wonder where the extra money was, or what the extra costs would have been.
Well, I think what happened was, you know, as your colleague was mentioning, like the deinstitutionalization was happening slowly. People were moving out. So it started to become big empty spaces as well. Like there were fewer and fewer people in the institutions. So it started to become more expensive to keep them open as opposed to, right?
Plus, I think if there was nothing available for those who weren't in institutions, that cost zero versus those who did institutions. So, you know, I think it'd be very interesting to do the same research on the people, families, et cetera, who did not have their kids in the institution. So, you know, what was that like? I mean, are the siblings saying, you know, worst years of my life growing up with siblings, or versus the sort of guilt of having given up? I think there's a whole other group. So the cost could go up because now if there's funding available for community resources, it's for everybody, which includes those who would have been institutionalized.
The pay scale for very hard staff in group homes was significantly lower than.
That's right.
So that's you know, that was a big.
And institutions had I understood a stronger, like, benefits and things like that that were more secure, right? So I think that was another feature. Yes.
I wish I had another hour.
I know, I'm
To do the
sorry.
history of.
Yeah.
So Dr. Goldberg was a consulting psychiatrist at Southwest Regional Center?
By the way, I
Yeah.
spent 2 months as the superintendent of Iridia,
Okay.
and when they fired the previous administrator.
Oh, okay.
What happened after your 2 months?
Right?
What happened after your 2 months?
I had a gallbladder attack.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
But the interesting thing that I did the day that I went to Iridia was I asked all the staff to meet,
Yeah.
and I put them all in a circle, as opposed to a hierarchy of which is like a military facility.
Right.
So one of the things is, how does one define an institution?
Uh-huh.
For example, CPRI was called an institution to keep children out of institutions. And one of the important things about, I did a little cheating. I looked up some of your papers, and you do focus on autonomy of the individual. And the autonomy of the individual, giving them as much independence as possible. And one of the things in a hierarchical institution is that you may not, the general is the one that gives the orders.
Yeah.
So what is it that makes an institution an institution? And it's a hierarchical and not giving as much autonomy and independence to the individual as possible. So that's just a brief thing. So I think one of the important things about is the organization of an institution, not the construction or that type of thing. But what is it that happens? How much autonomy does one give not only the individual, but also the staff? I have consulted to the people at L'Arche, and Jean Vanier did visit CPRI along. And one of the things I said to Jean Vanier, and I know he's going to be sainted before he dies, is it possible to love too much? And what I meant by, because I remember there was a video of Jean Vanier picking up a multiply handicapped individual and escorting him to a service. And I said, now why didn't the L'Arche at that time, it was the European L'Arche, supply an electrical wheelchair to get him from, for him to be able to get himself to the service. So love is important, but autonomy and being able to give an individual maximum ability is another thing. And I think that CPRI, I think, was one of the emphasis for that is that.
Right.
So we can get it. We can also take a look at society in general. The original institution for the insane and the people was in Toronto, but the parents out of sight, out of mind. So one has to take a look at the culture of the time.
Yes.
And the big question is, what was the impetus behind the parents suddenly saying, no, we're not going to place the child in a large institution?
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that something about the Holocaust and genocide in Europe had a great deal, because the mentally handicapped eugenics came first.
That's right.
Then the Jews, then the blacks, then the homosexuals. Okay. So, right?
And the gypsies.
And the gypsies.
Yep.
So I think there was this climate that happened after World War II that had a big influence on society and the parents.
Yeah.
And it was the parent organization that said, we want a facility like CPRI. And the executive director of the Ontario Association became the first chief psychologist at CPRI. And the university, of course, with Murray Barr, with the bar bodies, said we want a place to explore. So science and institutions like CPRI aren't incompatible. I've got a slideshow sometime, we'll bring it out there, the history. But I think one has to take a look at, as you say, the whole society of labor, and one has to be careful about doing a sample of 10 people.
Yeah. For sure. Oh yeah, you can't generalize this to everyone. This is just what people that I spoke with told me.
But,
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
also the climate
Mhm.
of the institutional life. is
But
very
I think you're right, Ben, but I think when we talk about climate, obviously things are different. I think we hopefully respect people more and recognize that. But it's interesting, I think that in Iceland, my understanding is that nobody's been born with Down syndrome in Iceland in about the last 7 or 8 years.
Yes.
There's 0 births.
That's right.
And so I think that there is still that attitude towards people with developmental disabilities
Yes,
that they should not exist or that we want to weed them out because of whatever reason.
or anyway, that's different.
But you know, one question I have, Madeline, is where
Mhm.
getting about, but is how did things go wrong? So because we watched, so back in the fall we were watching a Geraldo Rivera's video about Willowbrook in the States, and it was a horrific place.
Yes.
But how did things go so wrong when they presumably started out?
Charity too.
Yeah, but when they started with good intentions, and how did they go so horrifically wrong?
It's a good question, and there is David Rothman's a historian from the States who talks about institutions turning from a dream into a nightmare, and so he talks about that. I mean, I think a lot of it is simply, first of all, the rehabilitative model, which is how the institution started, was we're going to bring people in, we're going to train, we're going to work with them, and then return them to their communities. That shifted, and a lot of it was, in the very early days, some of the families said we don't want them back because they're not productive enough. There was increased understanding about the nature of disability, that some people will gain some skills, but perhaps not enough to remain autonomous in their communities, in their families, contributing to the family business, whatever it was. So that was one thing. Overcrowding became a huge feature of that nightmare. There were too many people, and as Dr. Goldberg was talking about, so I talk with my students a lot about the institutionalization of staff that can happen in those environments where you basically have too many people with needs that need to be met, and there's only certain ways you can do that. You can't provide an intimate family atmosphere if you're trying to feed hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, from one kitchen or a couple of kitchens with a certain number of staff, etc. You are going to have a regimented environment, and you're going to have a plan imposed from above because it's the only way you can do it. So then the sheer size of them was a huge reason why things turned into nightmares. And understaffed. And so if you've got one person trying to take care of 10 multiply involved people, that's how you end up with things like cages, because they don't have ways to have one-on-one attention or whatever. So I think a lot of it has to do with overcrowding.
And I would think with so-called efficiency in businesses and the desire to weed out any inefficiencies probably led to less and less money.
Absolutely. Yeah, funding was always a big thing. And there was this weird thing with the Ontario institutions, like Huronia at least, for sure there's evidence of this, that the superintendents there were almost in competition with other institutions to see how cheaply they could do it. And so that's why there was things like gardens and stuff. They were trying to make them self-sufficient. But that mindset meant they weren't willing to invest more money to hire more staff and to try and provide individualized environments, etc. Now that all changed, in the later years, certainly things started to break down. There were fewer people, they were starting to set up apartments. Maybe you can speak to that too, like that some of the institutions had more familial type settings within them, like trying to set up smaller wards and apartments and things like that. I mean, that's a really good question. You give me a few minutes, I probably think of more of them, but those were the main ones, is that lack of return to the community and overcrowding, regimentation. So I know we have to go soon, so I just want to think a bit about the role of sort of traditional medicine in this, and we've already had some great discussion around this. But thinking about, because it's important, I think, for us to think about these conditions, and then how do we have to look for those still in our ongoing practices and make sure that we're not mimicking or repeating some of the practices, even though institutions look very, very different now. I mean, the big ones have closed their doors. But what are the practices? What are the conditions that are like threads that are still there from before? And to think for a minute about what role has medicine and other healthcare professions played in this history. And so that quote there, institutionalized immediately, was something one of the former staff said to me, is that he had the opportunity, because he had a supervisory role, of reading a lot of a patient's residence files. And he said that that was what he read from, that a lot of doctors had written on the child's file in the 50s and 60s institutionalize immediately or send, you know, he said he read a lot of files from sick kids in Toronto where they said send the child to Huronia immediately. So this is what he read, is that doctors were often recommending this. And we have to remember that doctors were one of 3 authority figures that families were relying on. There was medicine, there were educators, and there were clergy people, right? Like religious, who were advising families in some way or another. And so that was a pretty key role that doctors were playing in that decision to institutionalize. And that picture is from, I have to call it a propaganda video. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It's called One on Every Street, that the government made in collaboration with some doctors to promote the idea of institutions for children who had disabilities as the best solution for them. And I don't have the exact date. I believe it was made in the 50s. And so one on every street.
What's the band
No,
have
that's
to do with?
So the band was at Huronia. It was in, so that was to show people that there were, you know, things people could do. There was recreation, there was music, there was things that they could do inside the institution. So it's a very interesting video because it starts with a couple in a doctor's office, and they are really distraught because the doctor has just told them that their daughter is retarded and that she should go to an institution. And the mom is falling apart, basically. So it's this very classic, there's a couple and the doctor, and then they talk about the benefits of sending a child to an institution. And then there's this very strange piece in the video where they're showing, they play this really gloomy music, and they show people who are quite handicapped, quite involved, kind of being marched through a hallway, and it really looks very gloomy and horrible. So kind of saying this is that, like, we got to keep them out of the community. Very, very kind of a strange, and it really does present the image that these institutions are essential for a number of different reasons, and that's why we have to support them. So it's worth seeing, but what's interesting is you can't find it. The only place I watched it is at the archives in Toronto. I actually ordered one for the library at Western, and the person, anyway, it's been extremely difficult.
It's not
That
even
was,
on YouTube?
you can't find it. I tried everything to try and get a copy because I think it'll be so informative for students to see this. You get the historical background, and
And I think Ben and I and Sarah knows someone who, when her daughter was born, her daughter has Down syndrome, and I think the obstetrician told her, I think the obstetrician told her that she should send her daughter to the institution. So it was right at the time of birth. So, you know, she put it, and I think, and they told her to forget about her.
what was this?
Oh, the daughter's like 70 now, so there's a
Oh,
long
okay,
time,
okay.
or 60. She didn't maybe she's in her late 50s, so it was a number of years ago.
Yeah.
But it was, I'm trying to defend psychiatrists, really. So I'm trying to do so.
And Sarah Greenberg, it was the rabbi. that sent her to
Oh, really? I
institution.
didn't realize that. Oh.
Rob, it was the same with Christine's
Christine Hodgins?
Christine Hodgins, they were Christine Hodgins.
Yeah, but I think the question is, well, why would some parents refuse at that time? And it may have been also parents who had the financial resources to not send their kids.
Right.
May have been
Yeah.
part of it as well.
Thank you.
Once my uncle who used my kid, there was son born with unlimited, and he was told that to put him in the institution, forget about him, and they said no.
Yeah.
And I think then you hear those horror stories. There was some guy, I think he was in a Rideau Regional Center, who actually had cerebral palsy and
Yes.
didn't have an intellectual disability. I think he sued the government.
He sued his parents, actually.
Okay.
So there's a job podcast on CBC Radio, the Sunday edition about him.
But it sounds like it really expanded to just people with obvious cognitive disabilities to anybody, essentially for anyone with spina bifida and somebody with cerebral
That's
palsy.
right.
It
Yeah.
didn't have an intellectual disability, is my understanding.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very much broader.
Yeah.
I mean, I think any of these blanket statements never turn out to work.
Right. Yes.
But that's a blanket statement right there, isn't it?
Perhaps, but I mean, you know, you can have hypertension,
Yeah.
you must take medication. I mean, if you start applying that, there's going to be
Yeah.
people where that doesn't apply.
Right.
You know, and so another example would be like attachment disorders. There was sort of a thing out there, if you have attachment disorder, you should go to a group home because there's staff there that are better able. This is, working with the CAS, that's what they all believe in. I believe it came from Toronto, but anyway, I'll blame it all on them. You know, because there would be staff there that would be better able to handle the sort of attachment disorders and try to keep them in the family. Just kept breaking down. And I think, you know, there are some kids who do have trouble in a family situation, but if that was being applied in a blanket way. So of course it's not true. So I think Yeah,
That's a
your
good
child
point.
has a disability of whatever kind, you must go to an institution.
Yeah.
I think we just have to be really wary of these.
Of any kind of,
Of
exactly,
any
any
kind of-
kind. And when we, so I guess the question I'd love to leave you with is just what are the new blanket sentences that we're using, or the new things that kind of mimic institutional practices, even though they look very different, if you know what I mean. So I know we kind of have to finish, but because I'm an old OT as well, I worked as an OT, and so I think about this a lot in my reading for this research. It was really interesting to think about how have rehab professions and social work, etc., relied on the disabled person for their own professions and the profession's development. And social work, critical social work writers, academics, discuss this quite a bit, is how the development of social work, the development of OT has been dependent on certain kinds of people and their existence. And so, critical disability studies scholars talk about the use of language and science to sort of build up these categories of people which then justify the profession's existence, which then justifies the institution's existence. And so I just think it's really important to think about that, and so as someone who used to work as an OT, I think about what did I do in participation of that, sort of creating the disabled subject that justified my existence as an OT, right? And so I think it's just a good question to carry with us as we practice in working with people who are marginalized or given some kind of diagnosis, is how much of that are we participating in and perpetuating? So it's just some good questions, I think, to take with us. And for me, also, I like to think about practices. I talk with my students a lot about institutional practices. So we've closed the big institutions, but where do we still have institutions without walls in our society? And how do we carry those practices on in group homes of all, like by community living, group homes with large, where we are carrying over things like not allowing people to make decisions, denying people's autonomy, having things like exit signs in the building, whatever, that make it feel like an institution. But even in the way we speak with people, in the way people's lives are regimented, etc., how are those carried over, even though the big buildings don't exist anymore, right? And I think a lot about policy. ODSP, I think, is a really archaic policy, in my opinion. It really keeps, and OW in particular, keeps people in poverty, and makes it really hard for people to work and be active in the community and yet still be supported by the government. It's really, I think Ontario has one of the most archaic
I think
systems.
they're trying to change that, where there's less and less clawback.
There's less clawback, it's true,
Yeah.
but there's still control. If you earn this much, we're going to take this much back, So how do we get away from that? Because those are the kinds of walls that still exist.
But I think, even those kind of statements also, I think what we tend to see here, perhaps, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, we tend to see people with intellectual disability who are more severely disabled. And so I think that these statements about, I don't want to say autonomy doesn't apply, but I think that the people who aren't able to look after themselves or don't have the skills or the ability, I think we then have to think that institutionalization isn't necessarily the way to go, but it may be that living independently is not really a realistic option for most people. And so I think that we have to look at different policies for different.
And how do we support families?
Yep.
How do we support families so that they can, because families have the ideas. So I think, need the support and the funding and the community around them to say, hey, we would like to support you to have your child at home, but this is, and the families often know exactly what they need. And they're not given the creativity or the leeway to know how to do that, or the funding to do that.
But I think that still happens, where people have a kid at home they can't manage because of aggressive behavior, and really then the only other option is, because it affects their finances, they can't work, and then the option is a group home, which frankly it's hard to find for kids. And so there's not really options for people, and there's not enough resources. Then I think we would all agree that people need more support.
But it's far away.
Exactly.
Super common. Yes, we have somewhere, but it's Niagara Falls.
That's right.
And
That's really
sometimes I just don't even know if that's true. If someone says that, to kind of push back, are you sure you can't manage? Because if you say no, then we're sending your child to.
And then
like a threat.
That's right. It's like a threat, and then there's no other alternatives given. Like, well, what if we gave you this kind of arrangement? I mean, I think there's so much more we could do creatively.
I also think the ODSP example you just gave is a good example of the current system that we're not actually addressing. So
yes,
I think of ODSP or disability tax credit, like, okay, your child has a disability, but here, I can help you get some money to help your child. But I'm not sitting here and analyzing whether this is a good way to give out money or anything. I'm seeing it as a plus. Here I can help you get it.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
just like, I'm sure if I was back in the 50s, I would say, well, here, I can help you find a good place to look after your child without really questioning whether that was good. It's just what's available.
Right.
Whereas ODSP and disability, that's what's available, so that's
That's
I'm
what,
giving you.
absolutely.
But I'm not being
We were talking
asked or
before
even critically thinking
Yeah.
about the
about it.
home share program.
Yeah.
You're
Right.
involved with that?
Yeah.
Home share program is a very
Yes.
unique one,
Yeah.
in which multiple handicapped, severely handicapped children are living in a
Yeah.
essentially foster home,
Mhm.
which is a,
I did hear about that. It sounds like a really neat program.
Yes.
Yeah.
and I imagine it's a matter of funding as to how that's done.
It's like a
how it
resource that's
continues.
this big.
And also finding, and also finding families that will take certain kids. Maybe you would want to say
That's right.
something before?
I think Claire kind of got at it, the fact that your participants, your study participants are so capable of participating
Yes.
in the study suggests a higher level of functioning
Yeah.
than some of the kids.
For
that
sure.
We see here.
Yeah.
The component you mentioned here was 78, so that would be.
That would be BID.
That would be
Yes,
IDN.
yeah.
But those people would have still ended up in institutions in the past.
Oh,
They
yeah.
used to have, I think, the history of terminology in this area, as people know and fixated on it, it's very rich, to say the least. But I think they used to
Yeah.
have what they call moral imbeciles. So basically prostitutes
right.
were seen as moral imbeciles.
There was, yes.
And so they would often be institutionalized because they were morally imbecilic, I guess. So,
And so
Yeah.
there was this moral overtone, and that was a eugenic fear as well.
Yeah.
I think you had
So I wonder if you've been following any of the stuff going on in Australia with their national disability insurance scheme.
You know what, I've read a bit about it, but not, you probably know more than I do, it sounds like.
Something I've been looking into.
Yeah.
It's a whole shift, and it's not without its flaws either.
Is it
But one thing that struck me is that it's a culture shift away from seeing disability funding as a welfare, we will, they're a burden on society, this is the pot of funds that we will put forth and come up with kind of solution to a broad-based, any person could become disabled or a
Right.
disabled person at any point in their life, therefore we're going to create an public insurance plan, and the vision was that it would be like a Medicare system, but for different services. But something that they have latched onto still, and so they've launched this in Australia 3 years ago, and it's now being launched more broadly as of this calendar year.
Yeah.
But it does, they're seeing some difficulties in that people are looking more to purchase with the funds that they get, very much direct therapy-driven, hands-on therapy, which is counter to the rehab model and evidence around contextual, routine-based therapy practice every day.
Right.
So it's still a disconnect between what families would actually go out and look for, and they're trying to figure out, is that education, is that culture, what is that? But it's also very much built on a capital, market-driven system, ironically.
Yes.
That you create need and funding, then people create services that can be purchased. So I think it's an interesting thing to be following, because there's
Absolutely.
groups there's the
Yeah.
Every Canadian Counts Coalition.
And
that
the
is
counselors
trying to
have
bring this
compulsory training.
What's that?
The counselors working in Australia have compulsory training every year.
Which counselors?
The counselors who look after the mentally handicapped in Australia,
Mhm.
in the community, have compulsory training every year.
but Jackie, is that, do people, with the amount of funding that people get or whatever we want to call it, does everybody get the same amount?
No. So this is the thing that like Canada's looking towards, with the autism program,
Yep.
with them wanting to shift it to a needs base.
Yep.
Part that. But so Australia is how they try to build it is that it's needs based, not diagnosis based. So they have two streams. They have one for kids under 7, where they recognize you may not have a diagnosis or even need one because it's for developmental delay. And that's one stream that you get into. But your funds it's like an equivalent of the childhood budget. That's where.
But I think the problem having, this goes back to what you're saying about ODSP, Claire, is that everybody gets the same amount regardless of their level of need. And I think, so we have some families with kids with ADHD and language disorders who are in school, but
No,
their
this
families.
is different. This would be
But
needs based.
I think the problem here is, so it's equal but not equitable. And I think so people who have profoundly disabled kids who one parent has to stay home, so their income drops dramatically because of that. or has to be available, they get the same as somebody else's child is mildly affected who, and then it does become somewhat regressive, I suppose, because there's the encouragement for people to work when they get older, if they're able to, is less and less, unfortunately.
Well, it was visioned to be needs-based, but the possibles there are that it's very much a market that you have to be a savvy person to navigate.
Yes.
So if you're a more of a vulnerable, from a vulnerable population or marginalized population like they have with some more rural communities like we do as well, you have to spend some of your dollars to then hire a case manager. Or so it still has inequity built into it. It hasn't been as perfect, but I think it's a real flip because it's all based on taxation systems. So there's more
Right.
money going into the pot.
Interesting. Well, I certainly will look that up. That's really helpful, actually. Yeah. So just, I know everyone has to go, so I just want to leave you by just pointing out that the White Coat Black Art episode that is on CBC Podcast has a segment with a survivor of Huronia speaking, and it ends with self-advocates speaking about what they think medical doctors need to do in order to establish better relationships with them. And it's just, I think, worth listening to at some point. There's the link there. I don't know if I can send these slides to you or whatever, or you can just.
I haven't, I listened to it,
Oh.
actually not even knowing that you were on it.
Yeah.
It was in
I have a very
November.
small part, by the way.
Yes, the name was From Victims to Advocates.
From victims to advocates, yeah. And so I took just a couple quotes from it. Dr. Brian Goldman, as you know, who hosts that podcast, says their job is to teach healthcare professionals like me and to teach us that they are worthy of our time and attention and they are very good at their job. And then one of the self-advocates said, understand the fact that we know how we're feeling. We don't want you to cut us out of the conversation. That's all we ask of you, to include us in the conversation. So I just thought that was kind of a nice way to end, like just the idea that this is what this group of very strong self-advocates are saying about their relationships with health professionals, which is so starkly different from what you hear Christopher saying about his experiences in the institution, right? And then,
Available wherever on your favorite podcast app.
it is. And then David Rothman, the historian I was talking about, I just really like this quote because this always helps me to keep going and thinking about what do we have to do. We need not remain trapped in inherited answers, kind of like we always have to be thinking about how to make it better, you know, and you've all brought up these really great points about how to do that, you know, we've changed a lot already. Okay, we've closed the institutions. There's still lots and lots of issues, hundreds of people who need homes, families that need support. So let's not think of inherited answers, but just try and keep being creative and moving forward. So that's it. Thank you for, oh my God, I went
So
way
I just want
over
to say,
time.
thank you, Rich. That was a fantastic talk.